Center for Latina, Latino, and Latin American Studies, and the Center for the Study of Women in Society, who not only provide seed funding for these projects, but also provide an essential space where scholars can exchange ideas, knowledge, and further this collaboration. We're so proud of supporting this project. We'll begin today with some opening remarks from Dr. Martinez and her collaborators, Dr. Lynn Stephen and Dr. Erin Beck, followed by a screening of the film. We've also allocated some time after the screening for questions and answers. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Sangeeta Gopal from the Center for the Study of Women in Society, who will talk about the center's 50th anniversary and their support for the documentary.
Thank you so much, Professor Chavez. My name is Sangeeta Gopal, and I am the director for the Center for the Study of Women in Society. It's an honor and a pleasure for the Center for the Study of Women in Society to co-sponsor, along with CLLAS, this screening and discussion of Ni Una Menos, Violence Against Women and Justice in Guatemala. I want to begin by thanking Feather Crawford, Eli Meyer, Melody Moore, Angie Hopkins, and Janae Wild for their perseverance and flexibility in organizing an event during this constantly mutating pandemic, when one has to pivot at a moment's notice from one modality to another. And to all of you for attending the event. It has been CSWS's privilege to support research on women in Latin America through the Americas RIG, which has been for decades one of CSWS's most active research collaborations, spearheaded during the past decade by Professors Lynn Stephen, Gabriela Martínez, and Erin Beck, who are all valued affiliates of the center and groundbreaking researchers in the field of gender in Latin America. In recent years, 2017-18, CSWS has provided funding for the initial research and production of the documentary you're about to see. This documentary has been directed by Gabriela Martínez in collaboration with Professors Beck and Stephen. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Gabriela, Professor of Communications at the School of Journalism and Communications, the head of Women and Gender Studies, and faculty in Cinema Studies, and most importantly, an internationally awarded filmmaker of over 12 documentaries. Gabriela has been a friend, guide, and mentor to me, and I have always admired her unique blend of creative and critical practice in her film work. As a documentary filmmaker, Gabriela centers her subjects, allowing them to tell their own stories and serve as their own witnesses, but she is also able to insert these textured studies of local struggles in a broader nexus of power, struggle, and negotiation. I recall this interplay of immersion and criticality, immediacy and analysis in her documentary entitled Women, Media, and Rebellion in Oaxaca in 2006 and 2007. But it has also been CSWS's privilege to support another side of Gabriela's gifts as a filmmaker, and I'm referring here to her abilities as a historian and storyteller, as evidenced from her documentary on the history of our center, entitled Agents of Change, A Legacy of Feminist Research, Teaching and Activism at the University of Oregon. Honoring the 40th anniversary at the university, honoring the 40th anniversary of CSWS, this masterful documentary was a deep dive into the archives of CSWS, intercut with the present, to trace the achievements of the center as a site for gender-based intersectional research in context both local and global, and always striving to support the most visionary and impactful research initiatives of our associates in the UO community and beyond. As CSWS gears up to celebrate its 50th anniversary next year, we are so grateful for associates such as Gabriela, Lynn, and Erin, who through times smooth and rough, especially rough, continue to enrich and push the boundaries of work on gender, struggle, and resistance. Please join me in welcoming, in solidarity and comradeship, my colleagues here. Thank you.
you, Sangeeta, for that beautiful introduction. I would like to begin by thanking the Center for Latino, Latin, and Latin American Studies and the Center for the Study of Women in Society for their ongoing support of our research and creative work here at the University of Oregon. And of course, the entire staff of both centers who are always supporting us and being so flexible all the time. At the same time, I want to thank my colleagues, Lynn Stephen and Erin Beck, because they have been an inspiration to me. We have been collaborating for a long time, and every time is just a delight, despite the fact that the topics that we are focusing on are heart-wrenching and are really, really important and many times even depressing. But we manage to work together and to make the best out of this type of topics so that people can learn from them. It's always a pleasure to work with researchers. As a creative person and also someone who does research, I really love the fact that we can collaborate. I think this is a great example of interdisciplinary work and the interdisciplinary and that we can break in disciplinary boundaries and mix research with creativity so that we can disseminate knowledge beyond the academy, beyond universities. I want to say just make 2 points about the genesis of this project. In 2006, when I was in Guatemala, I read a news article about femicide. And of course, violence against women is not unique to Guatemala. It's a global problem, and we have to think about that seriously, and we have to help our societies transform. But that was probably the first time that I came across these high numbers of femicide, which I hadn't seen before. And that called my attention. Over the years, I thought about it. And in 2017, like 11 years after that, and going to Guatemala with some frequency, I came to a conversation that was actually at CLLAS in the Center for Latino and Latin American Studies with my 2 colleagues who were beginning to do research on violence in Guatemala, which they will address that and talk more about that context. And that's when we had or at least I had the opportunity to begin thinking how we could engage together and start thinking about the production of a film on this subject. So besides that, we began filming in 2018, and then we filmed in 2019. In 2020, 2021, and 2021 were pretty much the time where we were editing the film. And I also want to address and thank the animators, 2 young, wonderful women from Peru, actually, who work with me in the animation for this film. And I think like this process of working on this documentary has been like an international collaboration, an intergenerational collaboration, because we were women from different parts, different countries, different ages, different backgrounds, and all of us put together to work and bring this issue to the table. So for me, the goal of this documentary is to stir up the conversation and to talk about the social plague that is violence against women. So thank you for being with us this afternoon and for joining us online from across Oregon and probably Guatemala and Peru and several other countries. Thank you for being here, and I'm gonna pass the mic to my colleague, Erin Beck.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you everyone who's attending virtually. Yeah, so I want to start out by sort of talking a little bit about the origins of the research project, and my colleague is going to be talking about sort of where we are now and where we're going with this research project to sort of give you a context, the broader context of this film. And so when I first came to the U of O, immediately I felt at home at CLLAS and at CSWS, two interdisciplinary research centers focused on issues that I was really motivated by. And it was through these conversations that the research project sort of took shape. I remember I was finishing up my first big research project, and Lynn came to me and talked to me about, she was being asked to be an expert witness in a lot of asylum cases rooted in gender-based violence coming out of Guatemala. And she knew that I had done a lot of research in Guatemala, and she sort of proposed the idea of, well, let's go to these communities that these women are fleeing and try to get a better sense of why this is happening. And I had read sort of in the news and academically about the creation of these specialized courts to deal with violence against women in Guatemala. And that really rose a puzzle of, if these courts exist, why are women fleeing still, right? And so that's basically the impetus of this project. It was my first time collecting data with another researcher. I learned a lot in the process. I feel like I've grown a lot as a scholar as a result of that collaboration. So I really want to thank Lynn for sort of bringing the idea to me. We were able to do that type of interdisciplinary research because of seed funding from CLLAS and from CSWS. Without those initial pots of money, we wouldn't have been able to go together to Guatemala or to have the time to really dive deep into these communities and talk to people on the ground. And so we were able to leverage that support into other funding. The Wayne Morse Center provided some funding, the Humanities Center, the Office for the Vice President for Research. And then we were able to leverage that into getting a Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation grant. And so it really goes to show how a little bit of money given to the right researchers and the right initiatives can really go a long way. I'm so happy that we got to collaborate with Gabriela. I've never co-produced a movie before. And so I learned a lot about that process. And I feel really excited about how to translate academic research into a product that can speak to a broader audience, because after all, that's why we do research, right? To affect change in the world. And what better way to do so than through the type of art like that Gabriela has created for her entire career. So in terms of the research that we've collected, Lynn and I have done over, I think, 200 interviews at this point with activists, service providers, government officials, judges, lawyers, victims and their families. We've done more than 30 hours of observations in these specialized courts. You're going to see a glimpse into these courts in the documentary. We've collected case files, and we've continued to work with a research team in Guatemala made up of largely indigenous women, and I think Lynn will talk about that. And we've been able to go pretty much every year since we started doing this research, except for the pandemic, because of this continued support by various centers around the university. I want to also be really clear that we could not do this research without all of those people who lent their time to us. Most importantly, the families of victims and their advocates. You'll see that the center of this movie is surrounded by the family of a femicide victim. And this family has been more than generous, sharing with us their thoughts on the hardest thing they've ever had to go through. And I feel incredibly grateful to have been trusted with this story. And I know Gabriela and Lynn feel the same way. So I just really want to say that my heart is with them, and hopefully that this movie can ensure that the memory of their family member lives on and has a broader impact. And the other thing I want to finalize with is, before turning over to Lynn, is, doing this research, it's really, you end up feeling very mixed. Because on the one hand, you go and you talk to these amazing activists and these amazing survivors and these amazing women and these judges who are really dedicated to their jobs. and are really dedicated to changing society and institutions in Guatemala. And so in that sense, for me, it's a very, very hopeful story. But it's also a story in which we are looking at the reality on the ground, in which these people are not really being supported by the central government, in which societal values are changing really slow, in which there's backlash to every step forward. It feels like there's attempts to push back, in which we continue to work on asylum cases because women continue to be abused and continue to find that they cannot turn to the state for help. So it's hard because it is a hopeful story, but it's also one that feels somewhat frustrating at times. And I think about that, this week when we have, in the context of all these attacks on judicial independence in Guatemala, a number of judges coming under threats, a right-wing government that is pushing back against the small advances that we've seen in Guatemala in terms of justice and gender equity. At the same time, we have activists and survivors produce one of the most important verdicts with the verdict against the human rights abusers who were accused of crimes against humanity for the sexual violence they committed against Maya Achi women in Guatemala. And so I really want to leave us with sort of being okay and sitting and recognizing both the accomplishments and how far we have to go still. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Lynn Stephen.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. I just want to repeat thanks to Chris and Sangeeta and to CSWS and CLLAS, and my dear colleagues Erin and Gabriela, and all the folks who have supported us through time. Claudia vivirá para siempre. That is how this film ends, that the spirit of Claudia will live forever. And that was printed on t-shirts that her family produced, that they wore to her trial, that they wore when they spoke to the press. And they also wore these t-shirts with her picture on it when they spoke to us. And when we filmed testimonies from them, not only about how it felt and what they went through, but about Claudia as a person. And that was very, very important to them, that what she was like as a living person be a part of this film. And I think the power of story and of her story and of her family is really what drives this film. And it's one of the stories I think that drives us in this endeavor. But we've heard many, many stories and gotten to know other families and other women. I first got involved, as Erin mentioned, when a couple of local activists came to my office and asked me to write an expert witness testimony for a woman who lives very close to Eugene, who had fled Guatemala due to gendered violence. And I knew that I had so much to learn. So I'm grateful to Erin, who had been doing research in Guatemala for a long time, and Gabriela, who had also done work, to be able to work from them and learn with them and work together. In my own research, I've used video over the years. I produced and directed a couple of films. And so I wanted to video and audio tape many of the folks we were interviewing, and they were quite amazing in supporting that. So as you know, you have hundreds of hours probably of audio and many, many hours of footage that then get reduced down into a film. And then you kind of lose all the information and knowledge that you have, but you have something that can quickly communicate everything that we were learning. And behind this film are a dozen judges, several dozen lawyers, women who worked in the Defensoría de la Mujer Indígena who supported us in Huehuetenango, women from the Fraternidad de Presbiterianos Mayas in Quetzaltenango, friends who put us up and who connected us, Oscar, who drove us around the country, and other folks. So I want to just make all those people visible and be appreciative. Eliar, who passed away from COVID, who we spent weeks with every summer. I want to remember him. And all of those folks who really made this possible and in some ways are visible and not. We do continue this work. The pandemic forced us, we have not been to Guatemala for more than 2 years, but because of these amazing folks and activists who worked with us, when we got this grant from the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, we worked with them on Zoom. And they we pushed the money out to their organizations. And they carried out 55 interviews with police, with local authorities, with women at the local level, the city or town level, who are charged with being kind of in charge of women's affairs, and with other people who do development work. We did manage to do some focus groups. And we did all this on Zoom. We met, we sort of discussed the questions on Zoom. They went out and did these interviews and uploaded the audio files. We had them transcribed, and then we would get together as a team to discuss what we had learned. And that's been a remarkable process too. And while we were doing that, we also showed the film to everyone who's in it. We showed it to everyone you'll see. We actually showed a rough cut to people before this version. And showing it to them on Zoom and getting their feedback, and particularly with the family, the extended family of Claudia Villegas. In August, we agreed on a date, and I think there were about 18 or 20 people, including her grandmothers and her cousins and her siblings, all watched the film, and that was quite amazing. So I'll stop with that because you actually want to see the film, I know, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. I just wanted to, before we start with the film, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who participated in this movie, especially to all the people in Guatemala who gifted us with their life stories, who are collaborating with the research that continues. I want to say that this documentary is not the end of this project because our colleagues continue to do research. Probably other films will come from that as a result of that. But just say thank you, muchísimas gracias a todos los amigos guatemaltecos que nos han ayudado en todo y nos han regalado sus historias. Esperamos que este trabajo les va, que es parte de lo que ustedes son y todo lo que nos dan. Simplemente podemos agradecer, no hay palabras realmente, y que la película pueda ser diseminada y que también tenga un impacto para transformar las sociedades de todo el mundo, to change societies around the world, not just Guatemala. This is a case study of Guatemala, but violence against women, it's a global phenomena that we need to fight against too. Thank you.
Okay, we will now proceed with the screening portion of the film. I do want to make a reminder that after the screening, we're going to have a question and answer. If you are interested in participating in the question and answer session, please click on the Zoom link that has been provided both on this platform and an invitation. So enjoy the film. Thank you.
La vida ya no vuelve a ser la misma. Los traumas son muy fuertes y dañan mucho todo el entorno familiar. Es un trauma que le cambia a uno la vida y le da un giro de 90 grados.
Varias llamadas entran a la cabina de comunicaciones de la 17 compañía indicando de un vehículo que se encontraba en el interior del parqueo del centro comercial El Triángulo. Y llegamos al lugar donde indicaban que pues ya se había llegado la hora de cerrar el centro comercial y el vehículo estaba en el lugar. Pues como somos los primeros en llegar, acudimos a ver si el vehículo tenía abierta alguna de las puertas y todas estaban cerradas. Y empezamos a alumbrar y efectivamente se miraba la silueta de una persona en la parte de atrás del vehículo. Por lo que mejor decidí vía radio indicarle a la base que me coordinara a la PNC. Una unidad andaba cerca del lugar y llegó al parqueo, ingresó al parqueo y les digo, miren, creo que hay una persona ahí, pero quería que alguien viniera, en este caso ustedes, para que tomaran nota, ¿va? Para ver si rompemos un vidrio o qué hacemos para abrir la puerta, ¿va? Entonces me dice el policía, deme un segundo, voy a averiguar, voy a llamarle a mi jefe para ver cómo procedemos. Efectivamente hace una llamada y al momento le digo, mire, tenemos que hacerlo rápido porque esta persona pueda que esté inconsciente y que tenga signos aún. Llego a mi ambulancia, saco una llave de chuchos, no cargaba más equipo y rompo el vidrio, levanto el seguro, abro la puerta, iban 2 paramédicos con mi persona y le digo a uno de ellos, mete el brazo y verifica signos. Enseguida lo hace y su respuesta es, ya no tiene signos.
Mi hermana era una buena persona, era una buena hija, una buena hermana, una buena tía, prima, amiga. Nosotros estuvimos como un mes, como que aislados, escondidos, porque teníamos mucho temor, mucho miedo de salir. Porque a esta persona no la habían agarrado, andaba todavía prófugo. Entonces teníamos miedo, pero a él lo agarraron a los 17 días exactos que había cometido el hecho. Todavía no habíamos hecho muchas diligencias, pero en esa semana, en ese lapso, yo recibo una llamada y me dice, soy la licenciada Rita de Fundación Sobrevivientes y nos ponemos a las órdenes. Y gracias a ellos estamos avanzando poco a poco en la audiencia, porque sí creo que uno quizá económicamente no hubiéramos podido avanzar de la manera que estamos avanzando. Entonces, qué bien que existan estas instituciones y que hagan el trabajo que ellos hacen, porque el apoyo que hemos recibido es psicológico también.
Globally, 1 in 3 women is a victim of psychological, verbal, physical violence, or a combination of these at the hands of her partner or other individuals. This means that approximately 800 million women are victimized, in many cases, by those who say they love them. Many women remain in abusive relationships due to the lack of individual income, oppressive social norms against women, but above all, due to fear. In 2017, the United Nations reported that roughly 87,000 women were murdered around the world. Of these, almost half died at the hands of their partners or ex-partners. This means that about 137 women die daily as a result of domestic violence. In Guatemala, many women experience verbal, psychological, and economic violence. Furthermore, 1 in 5 women experiences physical or sexual violence. The victims are of all ages, social, and ethnic backgrounds. In 2019, there were an approximate of 190 daily complaints of violence against women, reaching more than 45,000 in the year. Of these, it was found that 632 women died as victims of femicide.
La violencia contra las mujeres es el delito más denunciado en Guatemala según los datos del Ministerio Público. Hay más de 50,000 denuncias anuales y eso ya lleva, digamos, a una situación, poniéndolo en comparación con los delitos de patrimonio, ¿verdad? Que son los robos y tal, es el delito más denunciado.
Cuando una mujer pide asilo, pide protección porque ha sido víctima de la violencia intrafamiliar por parte de su pareja, un exconviviente, lo primero es que hay que creerle. Lo segundo es que si esa mujer dice que su vida está peligrando, su vida está peligrando, ¿verdad? Porque no sabes hasta dónde pueden llegar las conexiones de esa expareja o esa pareja.
Guatemala pues cuenta con la ley contra el femicidio y otras formas de violencia contra la mujer que entra en vigencia en mayo de 2008. En esta ley, una de las disposiciones es la creación de órganos de justicia especializados, tanto del organismo judicial como de investigación. El organismo judicial en el 2010 crea los primeros 3 órganos de justicia especializados en 3 regiones. La región del occidente en Quetzaltenango, la región del oriente en Chiquimula y la región central en la capital. Y pues en la actualidad ya tenemos la mitad más 1 de los departamentos de Guatemala con justicia especializada.
Posicionar y hacer que el Estado reconociera que había violencia específica contra las mujeres no ha sido fácil para las organizaciones y el movimiento de mujeres en el país. Yo quisiera decir que el primer gran logro es que se aprobara esta ley de femicidio y otras formas de violencia contra la mujer que nos permite develar parte de esta situación, que la violencia es uno de los temas más difíciles y más complejos en la vida de las mujeres en el país. Eso por un lado, que nos permitió crear juzgados especializados en femicidio, es decir, jueces que se forman para entender cómo funciona el tema de la violencia y que no estamos hablando de violencia común, de delincuencia social, estamos hablando de violencia específica por tu condición de ser mujer.
The law against femicide and other forms of violence against women provides a legal framework for greater protection to women who, due to their gender, suffer a variety of abuses within their homes and society. This law generally covers the crimes of femicide, as well as physical, sexual, and psychological violence. In addition, this law also incorporates economic violence, which takes into account a variety of ways women are abused, including limitations on property and labor rights, subscription of documents restricting women's assets, destruction of personal or other documents, and the denial of covering the basic economic needs of women and their children.
Anteriormente, el agredir a una mujer, provocarle lesiones, enfermedades, sufrimientos, tanto físicos como psicológicos, eran delitos de poca trascendencia. eran delitos conciliables únicamente con un acta. Actualmente hay una denuncia de violencia contra la mujer ante un juez de paz, por ejemplo, no tiene la facultad de conciliar o celebrar algún tipo de audiencia. Es obligación de enviarlo al órgano jurisdiccional competente, que en este caso es el juzgado y Tribunal de Femicidio y Violencia contra la Mujer, quienes deberán, por imperativo legal, dictar una sentencia que puede ser condenatoria o absolutoria.
Acá recibimos víctimas de todos los estratos sociales y de todas las condiciones económicas. En el caso de la violencia, regularmente cuando vienen al sistema de justicia es porque ya ha pasado el proceso del ciclo de espiral de violencia. Entonces vienen acá porque ya, o las mujeres ya han decidido tomar la denuncia porque ya se han empoderado de alguna manera, aunque el mayor porcentaje es porque se trata de delitos flagrantes, porque los hijos ya han crecido un poquito y son ellos los que llaman a la autoridad o porque los vecinos intervienen. Entonces la violencia es generalizada, es un ciclo constante y las mujeres son víctimas de violencia tanto en el seno del hogar como en el ambiente laboral, el ambiente social, ¿verdad?
¿Podría usted, por favor, indicarle al tribunal cuál es el proceso o procedimiento que usted realizó al momento de practicar la necropsia médica o legal relacionada a este dictamen que acaba de ratificar?
Se procede a tomar las fotografías correspondientes de cómo llega el cadáver a la sede de INASIF. Después se retira la bolsa donde se conducía, se vuelven a tomar fotografías para que quede constancia de cómo se conducía el cadáver y qué características tiene, ¿verdad? Desde ahí, de acuerdo a nuestro protocolo, se comienza a tomar fotografías de las lesiones, se hace el reconocimiento externo del cadáver. Después de se hace el reconocimiento ya a las cavidades, la cavidad craneana, después torácica, después abdominopélvica. En el resumen de hallazgos se encontraron heridas contundentes y cortantes en cráneo y rostro, equimosis rojizas en rostro con patrón definido, equimosis violácea bipalpebral en ojo derecho, equimosis violácea en manos, cianosis en uñas de ambas manos, fractura de bóveda craneana, edema cerebral y hematoma sudural de más o menos 200 centímetros cúbicos. Bueno, son equimosis que tienen una forma definida, ¿verdad? De una forma, tienen un patrón.
El sentimiento y las reacciones cuando estamos en las audiencias son muy dolorosas, porque es como repasar paso a paso todo lo que pasó y como que en cada audiencia enfatizar el hecho. Y es traumático. Como seres humanos creo que con este proceso le llegan a tocar a uno muy adentro, muy el alma.
El psicólogo o psicóloga deberá atender a la agraviada antes, durante y después que finalice el proceso penal. Es una de las funciones. Hacemos una primera entrevista en conjunta con una trabajadora social, ¿verdad? Para evitar siempre la revictimización. Entrevistamos, conocemos, nos preparamos antes porque físicamente hemos tenido nosotros al alcance el expediente donde ahí la víctima hace donde ya se describe lo que a la víctima le pasó. Entonces nosotros ya con ese conocimiento que tenemos ya de lo que hemos leído durante el expediente y teniendo nosotros en contacto la carpeta física, ya no es necesario volver otra vez a preguntar o a revictimizar a la agraviada. Más bien contactamos con ella físicamente en la primera reunión, en la primera entrevista, para tomar sus datos personales, para con ella acercarnos un poquito, saber de ella, saber un poquito de su vida, prepararla más que todo para su primera audiencia inicial, porque en esa primera audiencia inicial la agraviada tiene un espacio durante la audiencia. El juez le pregunta, ¿verdad?, qué quiere, qué espera o cuáles son sus intenciones al iniciar este proceso que se está llevando a cabo, ¿verdad? Entonces nosotros hacemos esa previa preparación para que ella entre por lo menos equilibrada la autoestima y que pues se sienta bien dentro de la sala de audiencia.
El transitar por la justicia penal debe ir acompañada de acciones políticas, comunicacionales, obviamente de seguridad, porque debemos garantizar la protección de las víctimas y de quienes acompañamos a las víctimas, pero sobre todo un componente psicosocial y formativo que logre cambiar el imaginario social.
Tenemos una lucha por la justicia para las mujeres y hemos ido, digamos, planteando políticas públicas, leyes, investigaciones. Tenemos una investigación sobre los femicidios. Hemos hecho campañas a nivel nacional y también internacional, sobre todo la articulación que como grupo hacemos, porque sabemos que este problema pues es un problema que no tiene barreras y asimismo debe tener un apoyo de todas, ¿verdad? No solamente nacional, sino que también internacional, y ahí hemos ido sumando, digamos, esfuerzos.
La ley existe, pero lamentablemente no ha tenido la promoción que necesita, ¿verdad? Y no se ha hecho en el idioma de las personas para que ellas realmente lo comprendan, porque el mayor porcentaje de la población es monolingüe, o sea, habla solamente su idioma. Necesitamos cubrir quizás, ¿verdad? No podemos decir el 100% que fuera ideal, pero un 60%, ¿verdad? Para poder trabajar esa promoción de la ley de femicidios. Existe, son muy pocas las personas que tienen acceso a radio, a televisión, que es donde pues más o menos se escucha, y el otro resto de población no sabe ni siquiera que existe la ley.
Acá en Huehuetenango se hablan aproximadamente 8 idiomas mayas en las distintas regiones del departamento de Huehuetenango. En este caso, pues es bastante importante hacer mención de ello, porque ello también implica poder contar con la cantidad de intérpretes para poder brindarles la asistencia a las personas, ya sea en este caso a las víctimas, o sea a los acusados, ya que pues en muchas ocasiones vienen de estas áreas y al estar en el tribunal pues en la mayoría de ocasiones no comprenden el idioma español.
Y el rol que tiene el intérprete dentro del proceso de justicia, pues es auxiliar a las personas que no hablan ni entienden el español. Y aún así también hay personas que sí lo hablan un poco, sin embargo es necesario comprender, digamos, todo el proceso jurídico que se realiza dentro de las audiencias.
No todos los juzgados tienen traductores, no todos los jueces y juezas tienen sensibilidad en el tema, ¿verdad? Y nos cuesta también con otras instituciones responsables alrededor del sistema de justicia, por ejemplo, los que son el INASIF, que es el responsable de toda la parte forense, psicológica, que tiene que hacer evaluaciones a las mujeres sobrevivientes de violencia. Casi siempre tratan a las compañeras de mal manera, no quieren que hablen en su idioma. Siempre nos enfrentamos contra eso y nos enfrentamos, por supuesto, contra la discriminación y el racismo todavía en el país. O de que no se les crea a las mujeres o que las mujeres no pueden expresarse en castellano y entonces eso dificulta que puedan poner una denuncia. Yo creo que eso sí es un tema complejo aún, hace falta muchísimo en ese trabajo y aunque siempre hay un compromiso del sistema de justicia, de todas maneras seguimos teniendo 90% de impunidad en los casos, ¿verdad? Todavía falta muchísimas cosas que hacer y hay todavía un subregistro de las mujeres que no denuncian, ¿verdad? Eso también es un dato que no existe, no lo tenemos, pero hay una gran cantidad de mujeres que sigue sin denunciar por temor a que no les entiendan, porque no pueden hablar el idioma, porque no tienen cómo movilizarse hacia donde están los entes de justicia, porque pone la denuncia y después no pueden seguir el caso porque no tienen un abogado o una abogada, no tienen cómo pagarlo, ¿verdad? Esas cosas todavía son un tema complicado en el país en materia de acceso a la justicia.
Durante el conflicto armado interno en Guatemala, en los años 80, hubo denuncias de mujeres sobre violencia sexual. Estas mujeres fueron concentradas en el destacamento de Sepurzarco. Ellas fueron obligadas a asistir luego que sus esposos fueron desaparecidos y realizar turnos en los cuales tenían que atender a los soldados, lavar la ropa, hacer la comida, y en ese marco se daban las violaciones sexuales. Las violaciones se daban dentro del destacamento militar o en las viviendas de las mujeres.
Sepurzarco logró develar cómo esa violencia sexual fue utilizada por el ejército de Guatemala como una estrategia contrainsurgente de control de los cuerpos de las mujeres, de los territorios de las mujeres y de las comunidades indígenas sobre todo, que la mayoría de mujeres que sufrieron violencia sexual en la guerra fueron mujeres indígenas, la gran mayoría.
Cuando se da la violación de las mujeres, no solo se está violando su cuerpo, sino también es violación del territorio, es violación de todo el cuerpo social, porque la mujer representa a la sociedad, es portadora de vida.
El Tribunal de Mayor Riesgo A condenó este viernes al teniente coronel Stilmer Francisco Reyes Girón a purgar 120 años de prisión y para el excomisionado militar Heriberto Valdés Asig 240 por los delitos contra deberes de la humanidad por el caso Sepurzarco. Concluida la lectura de la sentencia, la mayoría del público aplaudió a los jueces Patricia Bustamante, Yasmín Barrios y Herbie Sical. Varios de los activistas lanzaron consignas contra los condenados y volvieron a aplaudir porque se hizo justicia en el caso de las víctimas de abusos sexuales y esclavitud doméstica. La sentencia indica que las víctimas fueron tratadas como animales por los soldados. Según la jueza, el caso Sepurzarco evidenció el trato cruel e infame al que eran sometidas las mujeres. Los hechos ocurrieron entre 1982 y 1983 en el destacamento militar Sepurzarco, ubicado en el municipio de El Estor, en el departamento de Izabal.
Entonces, Sepurzarco es el emblema del empoderamiento de las mujeres, que a través del tiempo, no importa que han pasado 30 años, han logrado que se les escuche y que se haga justicia. Dentro del contenido de la sentencia, en la parte principal donde se habla de la responsabilidad, dejamos un texto donde decimos: el tribunal deja constancia en la sentencia sobre el valor de las mujeres de Sepurzarco. Es un reconocimiento moral para nosotros como jueces, muy a alto nivel, reconociendo ese coraje que ellas tuvieron de pelear por sus derechos. Con pocos recursos han abierto campo. Es una brecha y creo que es un ejemplo para mujeres, no solo de ese momento histórico, sino también del presente. Preservar sus derechos, no permitir que nadie les violente, que nadie les baje su dignidad.
La Defensoría de la Mujer Indígena es una institución de gobierno que efectivamente nace a raíz del conflicto armado interno. Uno de los acuerdos del conflicto, que es el acuerdo sobre identidad y derechos de los pueblos indígenas, se ve la necesidad de crear una institución que proteja todos los derechos de las mujeres indígenas, ¿verdad?, las cuales fueron violentadas durante los 36 años de guerra, de conflicto armado, donde la población indígena fue la que más fue afectada y específicamente mujeres indígenas. El trabajo de DEMI específicamente es el apoyo. Tenemos 3 áreas de trabajo. En este caso trabajamos con la unidad, el área social, el área jurídico, el área psicológica, que sería el área de atención integral de casos, que es lo que nosotros contamos en la sede regional de Huehuetenango.
Estamos enmarcadas dentro de una ideología
de la cosmovisión maya. Entonces el servicio está con pertinencia cultural. En este caso, por ejemplo, se trata de que las señoras reciban el servicio con identidad, con su idioma, con profesionales que son parte de su grupo étnico, que también sepan del contexto de sus comunidades.
El mensaje es muy importante, que principalmente le enseñemos a nuestras hijas a quererse y respetarse, ellas de primero, y aprender a valorarse como mujeres. Aprender a valorarse como mujeres. En mi caso, yo tengo 2 niñas. Yo les he enseñado a ellas de que antes de que esto pasara, yo les he enseñado que se tienen que respetar y tienen que enseñar a las personas, especialmente a los hombres, a que las respeten. Y ahora, con lo que nos pasó, es mucho más importante enseñarles a nuestras hijas que nosotros como mujeres valemos igual que los hombres, para que haya una equidad de género. Otra de las cosas importantes, desde pequeños enseñarle a los hombres que las mujeres son valiosas.
Necesitamos compañeros solidarios que se suman a esa lucha contra la violencia. Y no podemos pensar que la violencia es solo un problema nuestro, de las mujeres. Es un problema social, es un problema del modelo social en el que vivimos. Y entonces necesitamos también hombres aliados en esta lucha para transformar esa situación de violencia del que vivimos las mujeres en el país.
El tribunal, con base en las pruebas que fueron aportadas durante el debate, por unanimidad declaran como autor responsable del delito de femicidio a Ronan René Ramírez Montejo en agravio de la vida de Claudia Eunice Villegas González. En consecuencia, se le impone la pena de 42 años de prisión inconmutables con abono de la prisión efectivamente sufrida desde el momento de su aprehensión.
De este acontecimiento que marcó nuestras vidas, el inicio de juicio para obtener una sentencia de su caso inició el 28 de febrero del año 2018, en donde pues mis hermanas, principalmente Julia, Violeta y Marta Soledad, acompañadas de mi familia, pues empezaron a asistir a las audiencias, ¿verdad?, que se dieron en todo este proceso. Y Claudia era muy fundamental, y sabemos que a mucha gente le hace falta, ¿verdad? Pero que sabemos que la muerte de Claudia no es una muerte que va a quedar nada más ahí, sino que el fallecimiento de Claudia y la víctima de violencia que fue Claudia, que pueda servir para que una mujer ya no sufra más violencia, ¿verdad? Que una mujer dé ese paso de denunciar, ese paso de decir ya no más.
Hace un año que platicamos y yo me sentía temerosa, tenía mucha tristeza en el corazón y creía y lo sentía que no podía estar quizá de frente o me sentía un poco con miedo. Ahora en esta oportunidad creo que estoy en un momento donde toda mi familia siempre ha estado conmigo, pero hoy me siento más fuerte, me siento muy confiada. Estábamos a la expectativa de ver la decisión de los jueces, tomando en cuenta los derechos humanos, los derechos hacia las mujeres. Entonces estábamos a esa expectativa, pero creo que ellos hicieron un buen trabajo. Pudieron dar la sentencia de 42 años. Hubiésemos querido que fuera la pena máxima en nuestro país, serían 50 años, pero creo que con esto como familia nos sentimos satisfechos. Es cierto, no podemos recuperar a mi hermana, pero creo que esto es un precedente para que muchas mujeres también se den cuenta que si acudimos a las autoridades, si exponemos nuestros casos, nos pueden apoyar y puede haber un seguimiento para que puedan condenar a estos hombres que hacen daño.
Claudia, vivirás por siempre. Claudia, vivirás por siempre. Claudia, vivirás por siempre. Claudia, vivirás por siempre.
Thank you for staying with us and watching the film. Now we are in the section for Q&A, and we will be very happy to answer any questions. Please post the questions through the Zoom chat.
We have one starting question. This one's for Dr. Martinez. About creative choices. What's striking about the film is that it uses recorded video, found footage, as well as animation. Can you discuss your decision to use animation and what that allows you to do as a storyteller that other modalities might not?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, the decision to use animation in this work was after thinking for several months how to tell the story that the witness and the experts, like the forensic doctor, for example, were giving testimony in court. So how to recreate that without re-traumatizing people, especially the family. I was thinking of the family members who also were sitting there during the trial and hearing all these testimonies about what happened to Claudia. So traditionally in documentary, something like that may use recreation and use actors, but I didn't want to do that. Or I could have used the photographs from the archives, from the police archives, which were very gruesome, and I didn't want to re-traumatize people with that. At the same time, I was thinking this is an issue that we should engage young people and everybody from different walks of life to talk about. So how do we bring to the table people who may be turned off by the subject, right? Because it is sad, it is gruesome. I mean, femicide is not an easy topic. So I thought of using animation as a technique and device to recreate what the testimonies were telling, and at the same time as a device to engage different types of audiences into this story. So as a storytelling device, I think it's really powerful. It speaks of our times. It can be used with different types of audiences. And when we show this to the family and to the different people who are in the film, actually they really appreciated the fact that it was done through animation. So I hope that answers the question.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question here for either of the participants. First, thank you, Gabriela, Lynn, and Erin, for such a powerful film. I wanted to ask about the situation of LGBT community in Guatemala. Are they experiencing similar levels of violence? Do they have some legal protection as a community?
I can take that one if everyone's okay. So yes, in short, the LGBTQIA community in Guatemala does experience gender-based violence. Unfortunately, the law against violence against women in Guatemala is very much rooted in the gender binary. So there have been cases of trans women who have been killed by their romantic partners, and their cases have been heard in regular non-specialized courts rather than femicide courts, and been classified as sort of, a fight between quote unquote men. And so this is a huge gap that exists in Guatemala, even with the passage of the 2008 law and the creation of institutions of specialized justice. It doesn't actually provide real justice for a significant segment of the population that is uniquely vulnerable for multiple forms of overlapping gender-based violence. And so this is one of those areas or sort of roads we still have to walk forward that I had mentioned before. It's a huge gap.
I just want to add, also giving some historical context. In our work now, we actually, the question is, who has access to justice and what are the obstacles to that, which is a big question. There are at least 50,000 complaints, registered complaints about violence, and maybe slightly under 2,000 cases that go through these courts. But none of those cases include LGBTQI folks. And one of the things that struck me when we first started, before even beginning to work in the courts, was visiting the police archive in Guatemala City, which was this amazing find of all of these records that national police kept of people they killed, tortured, disappeared in prison. And one of the books I remember is a book of photographs where what we would now call trans folks, and maybe folks who were LGBTQI, who were detained, were profiled in these police books as delinquents, right? As delincuentes. And I think historically, the sort of impunity of police violence against women, but again, against people who push against that binary, who we would now call queer or trans or other categories, that's sort of wired into the history of who is a suspect, who's a suspect even when they don't do anything. And the interviews that we've started to do with police have been very interesting. We haven't focused necessarily on this topic, but the idea that women or certain people sort of ask for the violence that they get and that they deserve it is a narrative that we saw in court, and that you see continued, not just for women, but also for trans folks and people who are not clearly heterosexual. And I'll just add, not just in Guatemala, but I think all of these issues that we're talking about, we need to not think of Guatemala as such an exceptional case, because we can look at these same issues in our own country, in our own cities.
Yeah, I think the important thing to sort of clarify, like Lynn is saying, is that, and like I referred to earlier, we've seen there'll be, steps forward in Guatemala or in other countries when it comes to, we had in Guatemala the first openly lesbian congresswoman in office around the time we were doing our research. And yet this person was experiencing lots of threats against her life. And we've seen, since we started doing this research, the introduction of a lot of legislation centered around protecting the family and family values, which is like a coded way of saying anti-feminist, anti-LGBTQ rights. And this is something we're seeing not just in Guatemala. This is, very clearly in Brazil as well, where we have, a president who says that he would rather see his son die rather than come out as gay, right? And this is part of a broader backlash against the little gains we have seen in Latin America around these issues has led to a backlash. And that's why it's really important that we stay really vigilant on these issues and maintain these networks of solidarity, rather than saying sort of, oh, the law was passed or this institution was created and we could stop paying attention. We have to really stay vigilant about these things.
Can I just add one more thing, which I think is really important in the context of all of this, are the social movements that have existed for a long time and continue to exist in Guatemala, whether it's around femicide, feminicide, LGBTQI violence. So while the state is not necessarily making any efforts in that direction, there are a lot of people in the streets, networked, and really having a presence. So I think that's important to point out too.
Another question about the screening of the film. If it has been shown in Guatemala, if so, what has been the reaction? And are there plans to use this as an advocacy or an educational resource in Guatemala?
Yeah, I can answer that.
I can talk about that.
Yes, the film has been already shared with the family to start with, and then with every single person who appears in the movie, all the judges, all the people that work in the courts there. And also it has been shared with the different organizations, the different people that we interview for the movie, that they run different NGOs there. And they are beginning to utilize this documentary for their own goals to advance this, this topic and to open up conversations in Guatemala. We are planning to go probably this summer to Guatemala and do more screenings there, but it's gonna be, but obviously we don't know because of COVID, so we cannot for certain say that. But because the film is, we can disseminate the film through the internet, it's gonna be widely used also for education. Several of the judges already have told us that they would like to see this in the different universities where they are teaching law, and also in the preparation of the judges who are applying to become judges in specialized courts, because they have to go through a specialized training in gender to become judges in those courts. So there are different avenues in which this documentary would be utilized in Guatemala and have an impact there.
Yeah, I think it may already being used. I corresponded with the person who's in charge of the judicial training program for judges who go into these kinds of courts, and I think they're already using it.
So the next question is about sort of action and advocacy. What are action points for us viewers? Who can we support? What organizations, and how can we give our time?
Well, I would say one of the first things that people can do is, Gabriela has this amazing documentary called Keep Your Eyes on Guatemala. And so I would say very similarly, pay attention to what's happening in Guatemala. So, the documentary talks about the case of Sapu Zarco in 2016, this ruling that was like the first ruling in domestic court on a case of sexual slavery. And it's a huge victory. But since then, we've seen multiple attempts to pass an amnesty law, which would essentially stop all sort of trials, transitional justice trials, like the one we saw, come out this week with the Maya Achi woman or Sapu Zarco, and then also actually release those who have been convicted of crimes against humanity from prison. And this would be a huge blow for justice, but it would also put a lot of people in danger, including the judges, the activists, the lawyers who worked on these cases. And in the past, the reason why this law has not actually been successful in its third reading in Congress is because of pressure on the part of the United States. And so really pressuring the United States government, your local representative, to pay attention to what's going on in Guatemala. And then more broadly, the fight against corruption and to promote rule of law is really important there. I think there is some attention to that under this current administration because they think it's connected to migration. But the US has offered really inconsistent support and inconsistent pressure to actually address corruption and rule of law issues, which are fundamentally the root of impunity in that country. And so paying attention, being informed, and putting pressure on your local government officials is really an important step. And then the organizations that are featured in this movie, and then beyond that, a lot of them are very, very active on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. And so following them is a really great first step to stay involved, and also sort of when there needs to be these all hands on deck situation to respond to that call, either through donations or through solidarity, through pressure here. And so I would say those are two action items that people can start taking right away.
There's an organization in the United States called NISQUA, the Network in Solidarity with Guatemala, that has the longest track record, I think, from the US of working and supporting, monitoring, and you can look them up, NISGUA. And I think perhaps in the website that we're working on affiliating with the movie, we can also put links up for the organizations that are featured in the film.
And I also would like to say that, if you as audiences would like to become involved in this topic and advocate against violence against women, start here at home as well, right? I mean, the reports about the violence against women, violence against LGBT communities in our home, especially with COVID now, the numbers are just off the roof. So I would say that this is a topic that that we have to pay attention, and we really should care about that wherever we are as citizens. Okay, not think that we're gonna be helping just people far away, but what are we doing here at home to prevent violence against women, against LGBT communities, against vulnerable populations, and against violence, period. So I think that we have to think more deeply about that in a broader sense of what violence is, what violence means, and when we see it, we have to stop it.
Right, and there's opportunities right here at the University of Oregon as well, in Eugene, organizations that you can work with. And I think that's a really great point sort of backlash against trans people, against LGBTQ, women, people of color. This is all on the rise. So there's plenty of work to do, whether it's with your friends, whether it's talking to your family, whether, for me in my classroom, or, in many different situations, just being a participant, not a bystander.
And I'll add one last thing, is that the people who cannot access systems of justice in Guatemala or in Central America more broadly, they flee oftentimes. Sometimes they stay and, suffer consequences, but a lot of them flee. So This is intimately tied to issues of asylum and immigration law. And on that, we can be very active here and our voices should matter. So I would advocate for sort of a broader understanding of who a refugee is, recognizing that gender-based violence is an important driver of migration. And so these issues are all connected.
One of the points in the film that's made is that violence against women is partly cultural, and some of the solution might be educating boys to become better men. So one of the questions is, are there any efforts in Guatemala to educate boys to become better men?
Yes, there are some organizations that are working at the local level, having sort of tied oftentimes to UN funding around new masculinities. So there is some of that. It's tricky though, because I think that the bulk of the funding and the bulk of the attention, and I think in many ways rightly so, goes towards women's organizations that are working with survivors. From our conversations with activists, feminist activists who are working with survivors, we ask them, you know, what does this mean that there's much less attention to working with men, perpetrators in resocialization, what happens after these people get released from prison. And they were clear that, you know, somebody needs to do that work, but they were already sort of at capacity, right? And so I think, you know, there needs to be sort of dual movements there. One, sort of educating younger generations. We're starting to see some of that. One of the consequences of the Sapuzarco case is that the Sapuzarco case has to be taught in schools. That was one of the sort of reparations that came out of that. And so that's going to go a long way, I think, to educating sort of the new generation. But we also have to think about, like, what do we do with the adult men that exist now that grew up in a particular culture? And there needs to be more attention to these types of programs and recognition that when you are spending money on these programs, you're not spending it on men. You're spending it on behalf of women, right? And that's a harder sell sometimes. So
I just want to add one of the interesting things coming out of the interviews that we're doing now. You know, we're trying to understand the obstacles for women, particularly rural indigenous women who often don't speak Spanish. And these interviews have been in indigenous communities and have also been with local authorities who are supposed to know what the laws of the country are, and even women who are sort of elected to take care of women's affairs. And one of the things that's been striking is the lack of that people don't know that this law exists. They don't have that basic information in some cases, or maybe knowing about it, but not knowing what the implications are. And I think you could probably find the same thing here anywhere. So it's as Erin said, it's a very rich, not rich, but deep and complex problem with many different pieces. And the solution, the punishment, is prison time. And that's, the same here. And what happens in prisons is usually not so terrific for anybody who's in them. It's never. So it's, there are a lot of different proposals about how you should solve this problem. That men are supposed to have access to psychologists and social service workers, and the system is engineered very well, but there's no resources in the prison system, and even the court system has very few resources. So by starving the institutions that are supposed to do this work, it also has an impact on men as well as women.
Question here about the research with the police archives. Have the police in Guatemala seen it? And then also, how is their perspective informed how you see this issue?
So the police archives that Lynn referred to are the archives of the police from during the time of the armed conflict. Which the armed conflict, for those of you who don't have the sort of historical background, went from 1960 to 1996. During that time, over 200,000 Guatemalans were disappeared or killed. Whole communities were wiped off the map. People were targeted on the basis of their ethnicity. Acts of genocide were committed. And a lot of the roots of the gender-based violence that we see today against women, against non-binary people, against LGBTQ folks is rooted in the institutions and the cultural patterns that took root during that armed conflict. And so those police archives have been very useful for cases of transitional justice around holding those accountable for crimes that were committed during that period of time. That is somewhat separate from the police that are currently serving. The police force was reconstituted after the transition to quote unquote peace. Many, members of the old police sort of are members of the new police, so it's not so cut and dried. But the interviews we've done with, or that we've overseen with police have been really interesting. In some sense, there's some police who are sort of, present a good front. And then there's others that are surprisingly honest. One was very striking, in which a police officer basically said, about his own colleagues, some of my own colleagues beat their wives, right? And so when they show up to a house and being called in around intrafamilial violence or gender-based violence, there's sort of a tacit agreement, like, oh, like, could you do that more quietly next time, sort of. That just goes to show you that these are the police, just like the military and the police during the armed conflict, are generally speaking a hyper-masculine institution, and need to be more thoroughly reformed if they are going to have an impact. The police, after all, are essentially the face of the state in most communities. And so when you have the face of the state, arriving to the job as a person who is socialized in the society and who internalizes that in his own home, it makes sense why a woman doesn't just go to the police to report. Why does she stay? Why doesn't she just go to the police? Well, it's because those aren't reliable sources of support historically or in the present day.
And I just want to add some context, which is in many communities, there are no police. These are the national civil police. They're usually based in the county seat, or what we would call a municipality. So, for example, in a lot of the asylum cases that Erin and I have worked on, people and many of the women who came into these courts they're hours away. They are, 4 hours or 3 hours, and the only people that they can report anything to may be a local authority. And that local authority might be related to their spouse or might be related to their family. In small towns, there's not such a neat separation between kinship and authority. It gets very confused. So accessing police, often police usually don't get sent to serve in the communities where they're from. Guatemala has 18 different Mayan languages, and depending on how you count languages, if you're a linguist, there could be more. So often women cannot even communicate with police, even if they can get there, because the police, if they're indigenous, they may speak a different indigenous language, but more likely they only speak Spanish. So even being able to make a report to police involves a lot of effort, distance. You need a ride. You need someone to accompany you because you may not speak Spanish. And then all of the other reasons that Erin cited. We just lost a light, I think.
Is it okay? Okay. Yeah, no, I just want to add, I think Erin already mentioned this, but for anyone in the audience who may be interested in the archives, especially the archives of the National Police pre-peace agreement in Guatemala, the film that Erin mentioned, Keep Your Eyes in Guatemala, you can access that for free, streaming on, just Google it, Keep Your Eyes in Guatemala. And it's the entire history of these archives And it's over 10 million documents that have been actually, well, it's 80 million documents, 10 million of them have been digitized, and people can actually access those to some of those documents. But if you are interested in learning more about the police archives, just try to see that other documentary.
Yeah, and our colleague Carlos Aguirre in history also wrote a book about the police archives, and so you can see that the U of O has this like really close connection, this transnational connection with this country that continues to grow stronger the more research and work we're doing there. So it's been a really fruitful collaboration across borders.
Is there time for one more question?
Yes. So this is a question of method. It becomes clear that these are intensely personal and intimate conversations that you had with participants. How did that affect you methodologically? How did you approach the questions, both trying to get information, but also being very, very aware not to re-traumatize folks, as you said? How did you approach the work?
Well, the work happened in different ways in different contexts. Some of the first people that we talked to were judges, and we were kind of amazed at how easily we were able to talk to them. And I think that also tells us that not very many people were paying attention to or focusing on what they were doing, which was very, intense listening to these court cases. Oftentimes we would hang out around the courts and talk to prosecutors or other lawyers, but, people who are women who had complaints and their families were there. The complaints that, against a man, their families were there too. So there was a lot happening in the courts. And then also through some of the organizations we worked with, we got to know other people. So we had these conversations in different ways, in different contexts with different people. I think the one that was most intense, obviously, was the extended series of conversations we had with Claudia's family, and we met them in the courtroom. That was where we first met them and first talked to them. And then we continued discussions, over meals or in a hotel or, in an informal place, and really through time, got to know them.
Yeah, and for me, especially when I'm going to be filming these interviews, one thing is to talk to judges and film with judges who are more, it's a more professional relation, and they are talking about their profession, although they also see and hear, horrible things and stories. So, we have to build rapport with them, and then filming, especially people who have gone through, through abuse, or like in this particular case, the family of Claudia, who were in the midst of the trial, and every day, listening again and again what happened to their sister or to their daughter. That's trauma, right? So, and for me, when I was working with the sister in particular, one of the oldest sisters, I began filming and showing her what I was filming. So I would take, some shots as a test shot and then show it to her how she was going to be represented, right? And it's, it's a contract, quote unquote. It's a deep emotional contract that you do with the people that you are interviewing, and you owe them to them, right? And so it's kind of almost like a dance. And once you build rapport, they will open up and they will tell you what are the things they want to talk about. So it's a conversation. It becomes a conversation, right? To tease out the entire story. But as a filmmaker, I have to be always very mindful that what I'm asking, the conversations we are getting into, how people react, if they start, breaking down in front of the camera, not to be exploitative, right? Like to, stop or ask them if I filmed that, whether they really wanna be represented like that. And that's why it's part of my work that I do the rough cut You know, I do the backbone of the film and I show it to them. So we actually did that. The film went to them before I finished the entire film. And I got a lot of feedback, you know, from the family, from every single person that we have been interviewing. And I took into account seriously that feedback to finish building the story. And some things remain in the story and some things go out, right? And that's part of the process and the respect to these people who are giving us. This is a gift to us, right?
Maybe in closing, one of the questions that came up is how can people access and share the film?
Yeah, actually, there is going to be a website for this film that it's going to be launched probably in the next couple of weeks. It's already finished, and the film is going to be streaming through this website. And other way to access it is just if you send me an email to gmartine without the Z, like Gabriela Martínez, but without the Z at the end, gmartine@uoregon.edu. I'll be more than happy to share the link with you. But there is going to be a website with articles by Lynn and by Erin and by other people with a lot of resources, so people can, you know, learn more about the subject, learn more about Guatemala and other places. Thank you very much, to everybody in the audience. Thank you for being with us this afternoon, and you know, advocate for this issue. And when you see violence, stop it.